Well, Donald Trump has today come out swinging in full support of the 101 innocent hostages remaining in Gaza. He has threatened that if the hostages aren't released by January 20, there will be hell to pay. He said on social media, if the hostages are not released prior to January 20, 2025, the date that I proudly assume office as President of the United States, there will be all hell to pay in the Middle East and for those in charge who perpetrated these atrocities against humanity. He said those responsible will be hit harder than anybody has been hit in the long and storied history of the United States of America. Well, that's deterrence, and that's what strength and determination looks like. Well, you'd have to go back and think, what were the strongest words the current president, Joe Biden, ever said about the hostages? Mostly the attitude of the Biden administration was to put pressure on Israel for not doing enough to release them. There's been absurd victim blaming. There was certainly more pressure on Israel than on Hamas.
To end the civilian suffering of the Palestinian people and finally deliver a ceasefire and end this war. For months, people all over the world have called for ceasefire. I've consistently pressed for a pause in the fighting for two reasons: to accelerate and expand humanitarian assistance going into Gaza, and two, to facilitate the release of hostages.
I mean, just asking for a ceasefire, not demanding and forcing, as the leader of the free world should, that the terrorists release the hostages, who, by the way, include American citizens. And unlike Trump's clear threat to the barbaric terrorists that there'd be hell to pay, well, this was Biden's weak message to Iran.
What is your message to Iran in this moment?
Don't.
And in his delusional state, perhaps he thought his message resonated because he repeated it on other occasions as well.
What is your message to Hezbollah and its backer, Iran?
Don't.
The Ayatollahs of Iran were hardly quaking in their boots. And in response to Biden's one-word message, what did Tehran do? Well, it launched unprecedented direct attacks on Israel, including a barrage of 200 ballistic missiles. Biden also did everything he could to work against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Biden made demands that Netanyahu not go into Rafah, where the hostages were being held. He demanded he let Nasrallah live. He demanded there be no ground invasion. This despite the fact that 423 days on, there are still 100 hostages held captive by Hamas and other terror groups in Gaza. They've been in the dark dungeons, underground, starved, beaten, and some executed. It's thought, but we don't know for sure, that about half are still alive. Those who are still there include baby Kafir, his brother Ariel, and their mother. And it breaks my heart to think of them. Baby Kafir never even got to celebrate his first birthday in the outside world before he was dragged away by bloodthirsty terrorists to the hellhole of underground tunnels. It's beyond devastating to think of that, and yet no one speaks about the hostages. No one does anything. When I was in Israel, I spoke to two former hostages, and they told me just how bad the conditions were. One of them, a 63-year-old, Aviva Siegel. She was kidnapped in her pajamas from her bed. She said she could barely breathe in the tunnels.
The conditions were the worst conditions that you can think about. I just thought that I'm going to die, that kid's going to die.
She spoke about how Palestinian civilians celebrated as she was dragged, terrified, into Gaza. She said it was like a party for them. And her husband, Keith, is still captive, and she can only pray that he's alive. And he's an American citizen, by the way. The American president should have done everything in his power to try and secure the release of American hostages. But Biden hasn't. And more than 400 days on, Trump is now threatening brutal hell if the hostages aren't released. And it's a threat he made after having dinner with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's wife, Sarah, and son Yair at Mar-a-Lago. And Sarah did discuss the plight of the hostages at that dinner with Trump. It's a strong signal that Trump and Netanyahu will be able to work together to defeat terrorism, to bring home the hostages, and to stop Iran's aggression. It's been long enough. Strong action needs to be taken. We've been begging for international leadership, and finally, we're starting to see that leadership. We can hope that this determination and strong approach from Trump has a chance of working. Because Joe Biden's approach of appeasement, of going softly with terrorists, well, it was never going to work.